Olá a todos, essa é mais uma história aqui do canal e se você veio de lá da rede vizinha, não se preocupa que a parte 2 já vai começar. Mas antes, não se esqueça de se inscrever e ativar o sininho para não perder nenhuma das nossas histórias.
To those of you watching, get ready. You are about to see the full continuation of the story, so grab your blanket and your cup of coffee. She thought she'd won when she put on my dress. She had no idea what was coming. Ethan stood frozen in the hospital corridor, the resignation letter trembling in his hand, the second document beneath it catching the fluorescent light. It wasn't a legal form. It wasn't a hospital release. It was a single sheet of cream-colored letterhead, embossed at the top with a crest he hadn't seen in 6 years. Not since the week he'd signed papers he'd been told were standard capital partnership documents, and never bothered to read past the signature line. Miller Capital Group, it read. Notice of trust activation. Effective immediately. His eyes moved down the page, and with every line, the blood drained further from his face. Pursuant to Section 4C of the Sterling-Miller Strategic Partnership Agreement, dated 11 years prior, upon material breach of the personal covenant attached as Exhibit B, namely, the marriage of Ethan Reginald Sterling to any party other than Chloe Ann Miller, full voting control of the 51% preferred share block held in trust reverts, without further action required, to Chloe Ann Miller, sole surviving beneficiary of the Arthur J. Miller Revocable Trust. The doctor beside him cleared his throat gently. Ms. Miller asked me to make sure you received both pages together, Mr. Sterling. She was quite specific about that. I didn't see his face in that moment. I was 3 floors up, lying in a hospital bed with an IV taped to the back of my hand, staring at a ceiling tile with a water stain shaped like a comma, feeling nothing at all where a person is supposed to feel something. But I would hear about that moment many times over the following weeks, retold by people who had no reason to lie to me anymore, and I've come to picture it clearly enough that I no longer need to have witnessed it myself. I want to go back. Though, to the part nobody in that hospital knew, the part I hadn't told a single person in 6 years, except my grandfather's lawyer. My grandfather, Arthur Miller, built Miller Capital out of a converted garage in 1979 and spent the next 4 decades turning it into one of the largest private investment groups on the East Coast. When Sterling Enterprises came to him 11 years ago, drowning in debt after a disastrous expansion into overseas manufacturing, he didn't just write a check. He structured a partnership. Capital in exchange for a controlling share block, held quietly in trust, activated only under specific conditions, my grandfather never fully explained to me until I was 22 and freshly graduated. Sitting across from him at his kitchen table while he poured 2 cups of tea, neither of us drank. Ethan Sterling is a good boy with a weak spine, he told me that afternoon, in the particular tone he used when he'd already made up his mind about something. His father built a real company, and is going to hand it to a son who folds the moment someone applies pressure. I'm not interested in owning Sterling Enterprises outright, Chloe. I'm interested in someone inside it who can tell me the truth when the numbers start lying. He didn't ask me to marry Ethan. That part had been negotiated between our families long before I was old enough to have an opinion about it. A courtship dressed up as an accident of proximity. 2 young executives who happened to meet at a gala, happened to fall for each other, happened to get engaged within a year. I found out the truth about the arrangement only after I'd already fallen for him for real, which was, I've since decided, the cruelest part of the entire plan, whether my grandfather intended it that way or not. Take the secretary position, he told me. Watch. Learn who he really is when nobody important is looking. If he's the man I hope he'll grow into, the trust dissolves quietly on your wedding day and none of this ever needs to surface. If he isn't, he hadn't finished that sentence. He didn't need to. I understood, sitting there with my untouched tea going cold, that I had just been handed a test with only one visible answer and a hidden second one, and that only my grandfather knew which one he actually expected to happen. I took the job. I turned down 2 director-level offers from rival firms in my first year alone, telling recruiters I was building loyalty from the ground up, which was true in a way none of them could have guessed. I watched Ethan for 6 years. Watched him charm boardrooms and neglect the people who did the actual work. Watched him take credit that should have gone 3 levels down. Watched the way he flinched from conflict and let other people absorb the consequences of decisions he was too comfortable to make himself. I told myself for most of those 6 years that I was simply doing my job, and that the part of me collecting evidence was just professional thoroughness. I hadn't told myself the whole truth. Some nights, alone in the apartment with the ring on my finger and the wedding date circled on a calendar I updated every time it moved, I let myself believe none of it would matter, that the man in front of me and the man in my grandfather's warning were two different people, and that I would never actually need what I'd built. I was wrong about that. I understood exactly how wrong 3 weeks before what should have been my wedding, standing in a lobby with a camera in my hands, photographing my best friend's mouth pressed against my fiancé's. A day after everything that happened at the hospital, before I'd even changed out of the gown, I called the only number I trusted completely. My grandfather's attorney, a sharp, unhurried woman named Denise Okafor, who had drafted the original trust documents and had been waiting patiently for 11 years for me to make exactly this call. "You're certain," she said. It wasn't really a question. "I've never been more certain of anything," I told her, my voice flat and steady in a way that surprised even me. "Activate it." 3 days after I left that hospital, I woke up in my grandfather's old house, the one he'd left me outright, separate from any trust, a detail Ethan had never known because I'd never told him I owned it, to the sound of my phone lighting up over and over on the nightstand. 41 missed calls, most from numbers I didn't recognize, 2 from Ethan. I didn't answer any of them. I made coffee instead, sat on the back porch where my grandfather used to read the financial section every morning before the rest of the world woke up, and watched the sun come up over a yard I hadn't visited in years, feeling something in my chest finally begin, very slowly, to unclench. By the time I turned my phone back on that afternoon, the story had already broken. Not the version the tabloids had run 3 days earlier, the one accusing me of fantasizing about my best friend's husband. A different one entirely, sourced from an emergency filing with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and confirmed independently by 2 financial news outlets before noon. Sterling Enterprises stock had opened 18% lower after an unscheduled board notice disclosed a sudden change in controlling shareholder status. Denise called it too. "The board is in emergency session. Ethan's father wants to speak with you directly." "Tell him I'll take the call," I said. Not the son, the father. Robert Sterling had always treated me kindly, in the distracted way powerful men treat people they've never bothered to actually see. When his voice came through the line an hour later, it had none of that distraction left in it. "Chloe, I need you to understand something," he said carefully. "I built this company for 40 years. I did not know about the amnesia. I did not know what my son let happen to you. If I had—" "I believe you," I said, and meant it. My grandfather had always spoken of Robert Sterling with something close to respect, which was rare enough that I'd remembered it. "This was never about punishing the company you built, Mr. Sterling. It's about the fact that your son signed a covenant 11 years ago and broke it in front of 300 wedding guests without a second thought about what it might cost him." There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I could hear, faintly, voices arguing somewhere behind him. A board in open revolt, most likely, the kind of meeting where alliances dissolve and reform within a single afternoon, once everyone realizes which way the money is actually pointing. "What do you want?" he finally asked. Not hostile. Just tired, and honest in a way I hadn't expected. "A meeting," I said. "In person, Thursday. I'll bring my own counsel. You bring whoever's left standing." A week can be an extraordinarily long time when you're waiting for something you've prepared for your entire adult life, and an extraordinarily short one when you're grieving something you never got to hold. Both of those things were true for me that week, sometimes within the same hour, and I stopped trying to reconcile them. Natalie posted twice a day, at first, soft focus photographs of her stomach, captions about resilience and true love weathering any storm, the comments beneath them filling with hearts from an audience that had cheered for her at my wedding. By the 4th day, the comments had turned. Someone had found the timeline discrepancy first. A boarding pass Natalie had posted to her own account 8 weeks before the wedding, from a trip she'd taken with Clara to celebrate her full recovery, dated in a way that made the paternity math impossible to defend. By the 6th day, she'd made the account private. By the 8th, a gossip outlet had done what I hadn't needed to do myself, and published the math for her. I didn't feel triumphant reading it. I felt mostly tired, the way you feel watching a house you used to live in slowly catch fire from a safe distance, relieved not to be inside it anymore, but not exactly glad about the fire either. Clara called 40 times over those days. I let one call through on the 9th attempt, mostly out of a curiosity I couldn't quite suppress. "You have to understand," she said immediately, her voice cracking in a way I might once have believed. I was protecting the friend group. Natalie was fragile. Ethan was under so much pressure from his father to just move forward and— "You're my sister, Clara," I said quietly. "Not hers." The silence that followed told me everything I still needed to know about where I actually stood in her calculation, and had probably always stood. Long before Natalie ever opened her eyes in that hospital bed with the wrong name on her lips. "I need you to know something else," I added before she could recover. "The company handling PR for Sterling Enterprises just terminated its contract with your firm this morning. I didn't ask them to. They looked at the footage from the wedding reception on their own and decided the liability wasn't worth the relationship." I hung up before she could respond. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was simply the first time in a decade I'd let a conversation with my sister end on my terms instead of hers. Her Thursday arrived colder than the forecast had promised, the kind of sharp autumn morning that makes every sound feel more deliberate. I walked into the Sterling Enterprises boardroom at 9 exactly, Denise a half step behind me, and found 11 people already seated around a table I had once cleared coffee cups from as a 19-year-old intern. Ethan sat near the far end, not at the head, which told me almost everything about how the balance in that room had already shifted before I'd said a single word. He looked older than he had 3 weeks earlier. Not wiser, just tired in the specific way people look when consequences finally catch up to decisions they'd assumed would never come due. "Chloe," he started, half rising. "Sit down, Ethan," Robert Sterling said without looking at his son, and Ethan sat. I laid out the documentation myself, the way I'd rehearsed it in my head 100 times over 6 quiet years without ever fully believing I'd need to. The trust agreement, the covenant, the activation notice, already filed and irreversible. Beside it, a second folder. The one I'd built without my grandfather's instruction. The one born entirely from my own choice to keep watching after I fell in love with a man I was supposed to be evaluating. Inflated consulting invoices routed through a shell vendor with Tyler's name quietly attached as a beneficial owner. 2 years of expense reports that didn't match the underlying receipts. A pattern of decisions that had cost the company nearly $4 million, while Ethan signed off without reading past the summary page, exactly the way he'd signed the covenant 11 years earlier. "This isn't retaliation," I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "This is simply what happens when someone spends 6 years actually paying attention while everyone assumes she's just fetching coffee." Nobody in that room laughed. Nobody offered a party popper this time, or asked me to take a photograph. For the first time in longer than I could remember, the silence in a room felt like it belonged to me. The board vote took 11 minutes. Ethan was removed from his position as Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately, with a formal referral to outside counsel regarding the vendor irregularities. Tyler, who had been quietly promoted to Director of Vendor Relations 2 years earlier, a promotion I now understood far better than I had at the time, was terminated before lunch. Robert Sterling stayed behind after the room emptied. "For what it's worth," he said, "your grandfather told me once that you were the most patient person he'd ever met. I thought he meant it as a compliment about your temperament. I understand now he meant something closer to a warning." "He usually did," I said. And for the first time in weeks, something that wasn't quite a smile found its way onto my face. 2 months slipped by in a blur of depositions, restructuring meetings, and a defamation lawsuit. Denise insisted I file against the tabloid that had printed the diary story without verifying a single claim in it. I won that case faster than either of us expected. The outlet settled within 6 weeks rather than let discovery expose how little fact-checking had gone into the original article. And I donated every dollar of the settlement to a hospital recovery fund quietly dedicated to women navigating the hardest parts of early motherhood. The same wing where I'd spent 3 days I would never fully stop thinking about. I hadn't planned to build anything from that donation beyond the check itself. But the hospital called a month later to ask whether I'd be willing to sit on the fund's advisory board, and something about the request, being asked to build something instead of simply surviving something, cracked open a part of me I'd assumed had closed permanently back in that hallway, with 300 empty seats. By early winter, I'd stepped fully into the role my grandfather had always quietly intended for me, though not in the shape either of us had originally imagined. I didn't take Ethan's old office. I sold my majority position in Sterling Enterprises' preferred shares to a holding group Robert Sterling trusted. keeping just enough to maintain a board seat and make certain, personally, that no one in that building would ever again mistake silence for permission. With the proceeds, I founded something entirely my own, a small advisory firm built around exactly the instinct my grandfather had spent 6 years training in me without either of us calling it that, paying close attention to people everyone else had already stopped watching. Natalie's baby was born in late November, 3 weeks premature, and I heard through channels I no longer had any real stake in that a paternity test had confirmed what the boarding pass had already made obvious to anyone willing to do the arithmetic. Ethan moved out of the house that had once had my name on the deed. I never found out where Clara ended up, and for the first time in my life, I noticed the absence of that information didn't cost me a single hour of sleep. Somewhere in the middle of that winter, Denise introduced me to a colleague of hers, a quiet, unhurried corporate litigator named Marcus Choi, who had helped her draft the defamation filing and had a habit of noticing small, specific things, the way my grandfather always had. He asked me to coffee twice before I said yes, and when I finally did, I found myself laughing. Actually, laughing. Not the bitter kind I'd grown so used to, for the first time in nearly a year. I'm not going to pretend it healed everything instantly, because grief doesn't work that cleanly, and neither does trust once it's been broken as thoroughly as mine had been. There were still nights that winter when I woke up reaching instinctively for a hand that would never again be there, and mornings when the calendar still occasionally caught on a date I'd once circled for an entirely different reason. But by the time the first snow fell that year, I noticed something had shifted quietly beneath all of it. I had stopped waiting for anyone's permission to take up space in my own life. On the 1-year anniversary of the day I should have married Ethan Sterling, I stood instead on the small stage of the hospital wing that now carried my grandfather's name, cutting a ribbon for the expanded recovery unit the settlement money had funded. Marcus stood near the back of the small crowd, not performing anything for anyone, simply there because he wanted to be. Robert Sterling sent a card, which surprised me more than it probably should have. My grandfather's old lawyer cried, which surprised me even more. I thought, standing there, about the wedding dress that had fit Natalie perfectly and never once fit me, and I understood, finally, exactly why. It had never been built for the life I was supposed to disappear into. It had been built for a version of me who forgot, the way Natalie briefly had, exactly how much she was worth outside of somebody else's story. I hadn't forgotten. I'd simply waited. 6 years of watching, 3 days of grieving, 1 boardroom of reckoning, until the story finally belonged to me instead. The applause when I cut the ribbon was warm and unhurried, the kind you get from people who came because they meant to, not because an invitation demanded it. A nurse named Renee, who had sat with me during the worst of those 3 days without ever once making me feel like a patient instead of a person, squeezed my arm afterward and told me the new recovery suites already had a waiting list. I told her that was the best possible outcome for a project born out of the worst week of my life. And I meant it more than the sentence probably let on. I didn't expect Ethan to come. He hadn't been invited, not because I was petty about it, but because there was simply no version of that afternoon where his presence would have made sense to anyone in the room. So when Denise leaned toward me near the refreshment table, her voice low, and said, "He's outside, in the parking lot, has been for 20 minutes. I felt something in my chest go very still. Did he say why? He wouldn't come in, asked if you'd give him 5 minutes when you're done. I finished the afternoon properly first, shook every hand that wanted shaking. Thanked the architect who'd redesigned the wing around natural light instead of the sterile fluorescence I remembered too well, let a photographer from the local paper take 3 photos instead of the one I'd originally agreed to. It wasn't defiance exactly. It was simply that I had learned, over the past year, not to let anyone else's timeline override my own again, not even out of curiosity. He was leaning against his car when I finally walked out, hands in his coat pockets, looking smaller somehow than he had in that boardroom 2 months earlier. Robert Sterling's son had always carried himself like a man who assumed rooms would rearrange themselves around him. This version of him looked like someone who had finally noticed they didn't. "You didn't have to wait," I said. "I wanted to." He shifted his weight, glancing once at the building behind me, the new glass wing catching the last of the afternoon light. "It's beautiful, what you built here. It's not for you to compliment," I said. Not unkindly, just honestly. I didn't build it for anyone's approval. He nodded slowly, absorbing that the way I imagined he was learning to absorb most things now, without the reflexive need to smooth it over or argue his way back into being the person a room revolved around. "I'm not here for approval," he said. "I'm here because I owe you an apology I never actually gave. Not the version where I stood in a boardroom and had my father hand me consequences. The real one. I crossed my arms, not out of hostility, but because the cold had started to bite through my coat and I needed something to do with my hands. Go on then. I told myself for 6 years that you understood the arrangement between our families, so nothing I did really cost you anything you hadn't signed up for," he said. "That was a lie I built so I wouldn't have to look directly at what I was doing. When Natalie got hurt saving you, I told myself the same kind of lie, that playing along was kindness, that you of all people would understand why I owed her that debt. I didn't ask you once, in 9 months, whether you were drowning. I just assumed you'd survive it because you always had." The wind picked up between us, carrying the smell of the hospital's newly planted garden, something green and slightly sweet that hadn't been there a year ago. I let the silence sit for longer than was comfortable, mostly because I wanted to see whether he would fill it the way he used to, smoothing over discomfort with charm instead of patience. He didn't. He just waited, the way a person waits when they've actually learned something. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine," I said eventually. "It isn't. And I don't think pretending otherwise would do either of us any good. But I believe you're telling me the truth right now, which is more than I got from you in the entire last year we were together." "That's fair," he said quietly. "I lost something in that hospital, Ethan. Something I can't get back no matter how any of this plays out. I don't know if you've let yourself actually sit with that yet, or if it's still something you're managing from a safe distance the way you manage everything else. But I need you to understand that no apology in a parking lot is going to touch that particular part of what happened. That part isn't yours to be forgiven for. It's just mine to carry." His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might argue, the old reflex rising in him, the instinct to make himself feel better by insisting he understood something he clearly hadn't fully let himself feel yet. Instead, he just nodded, and something in his face cracked open in a way I hadn't seen from him in years, maybe ever. "I think about it sometimes," he said, so quietly I almost missed it. "I don't have any right to, but I do." "Then sit with that," I said. "Not with me, not with the company." I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked back into the building, past the volunteers folding up the ribbon-cutting banner, past Renee restocking the reception desk with brochures for the new counseling program, and didn't look back to see whether he stayed in that parking lot or drove away immediately. I found, walking down that hallway, that I genuinely didn't need to know which. The following spring arrived early, the way it sometimes does, tricking the cherry trees along the hospital's new courtyard into blooming 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Marcus had taken to meeting me there on Friday afternoons, a habit that started as a coincidence. His firm handled outside counsel for 2 of the hospital's vendor contracts, and slowly hardened into something neither of us bothered denying anymore. "You've gone quiet," he said, that particular Friday, watching me watch a nurse wheel an elderly patient through the courtyard toward the new fountain. "You do that sometimes. Disappear somewhere behind your own eyes." "I was thinking about my grandfather," I admitted. "He never got to see any of this. The trust activating. The company. This building." I gestured at the glass and the blooming trees. "He built the tool. He never got to watch what it actually did once it was finally used." "Would he have approved of how you used it?" I considered the question longer than it probably needed. "I think he expected me to use it to protect a marriage," I said finally. "Not to walk away from one. I don't know if that would have disappointed him or relieved him. He wasn't a simple man. He might have felt both at once." Marcus reached over and took my hand, an easy, unhurried gesture that had none of the performance I'd grown so tired of in my old life. No cameras, no crowd chanting for a kiss, no audience to perform gratitude for. Just 2 people on a bench, watching cherry blossoms fall onto a courtyard that hadn't existed a year earlier. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think he'd have been relieved. From everything Denise has told me about him, it sounds like he built that entire trust hoping you'd never actually need it. The fact that you did, and came out the other side building something of your own, instead of just reclaiming something old, I think that's exactly the outcome a man like that would have wanted, even if it wasn't the one he originally imagined." I didn't have an answer for that, not one made of words anyway. I just let my head rest against his shoulder for a moment, watching the light move through the new glass wing, feeling something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for the better part of 2 years. News of Sterling Enterprises' quiet unraveling continued trickling in through channels I no longer actively sought out but couldn't entirely avoid, given how small the industry actually was underneath all its noise. Robert Sterling stepped down as chairman that same spring, citing health concerns that Denise privately suspected were as much about exhaustion as anything physical. The company brought in an outside CEO within the month, a sharp, unsentimental woman named Adriana Cross, who Denise had actually recommended, having crossed paths with her years earlier during an unrelated acquisition. I heard secondhand that one of Cross's first moves was ordering a full audit of every vendor contract signed in the previous 5 years, which meant Tyler's shell company didn't just cost him his job, it cost him a great deal more once the audit findings were referred, as they eventually had to be, to federal investigators. Natalie resurfaced publicly exactly once more in a heavily edited interview clip that made its way around social media for about a week before the news cycle moved on to something else entirely, the way it always does. She talked about resilience and betrayal and the difficulty of being a new mother without a partner she could rely on. Nobody in the comments seemed particularly moved. I watched maybe 40 seconds of it before closing the app, not out of anger, but because I noticed, somewhat to my own surprise, that I simply didn't have any curiosity left to spend on her. Clara sent one final message in early summer, nearly a year to the day after the wedding, that never should have happened. I almost deleted it without reading it, and I'm still not entirely sure why I didn't. I know you probably hate me. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know I think about what I did almost every day, and I don't have any excuse that makes it better. I hope you're happy wherever you ended up. I read it twice, sitting on the same back porch where I'd once watched the sun rise over a yard I'd forgotten I owned, my grandfather's chipped teacup warming my hands. I didn't respond right away. When I finally did, weeks later, it was 3 sentences long. Not forgiveness, exactly, because I wasn't sure I had that to offer yet, but something adjacent to it. Something closer to release. I don't hate you. I just don't need you in my life to be whole anymore. I hope you find whatever it is you were actually looking for in all of this, because it clearly wasn't me. I never heard from her again after that, and unlike so many other silences that year, that particular one didn't ache at all. By midsummer, the advisory firm I'd built out of nothing but stubbornness and 6 years of quiet observation had grown past the point where I could run it out of my grandfather's old study. I signed a lease on a small office downtown. Nothing like the glass tower Sterling Enterprises occupied. Just 3 rooms above a bakery that filled the stairwell with the smell of cinnamon every morning before 9. I hired my first employee that same week, a sharp, overlooked junior analyst named Priya Ose, who had spent 4 years at a rival firm being handed other people's credit the way I once had, and who cried a little when I offered her the position, though neither of us mentioned it afterward. Denise stopped by that first week with a bottle of champagne and a framed photograph she'd had copied from somewhere in my grandfather's old files. The 2 of us at his kitchen table, the one with the untouched tea, taken by some assistant I'd forgotten was even in the room that afternoon. I hadn't known the photograph existed until she handed it to me. He kept a copy in his desk, she said. Told me once it was the last conversation where he watched you actually decide something for yourself instead of asking permission first. I hung it above my new desk. Chipped teacup on one side, that photograph on the other, and found that the office finally felt like something that belonged to me rather than something I was merely occupying. Marcus proposed in early autumn on the same bench in the hospital courtyard where he'd once told me my grandfather would have been relieved. He didn't make a production of it. No orchestrated flash mob, no photographer hidden in the bushes, no crowd chanting anything at all. Just the 2 of us, the cherry trees bare again after a full turn of seasons, and a ring that had belonged to his own grandmother, plain and a little worn. Nothing like the diamond that had once sat too tight and wrong on my finger in another life. I know weddings might be complicated for you, he said carefully, kneeling there in the cold with a steadiness that had nothing to do with performance. We can do this however you want. Small, private, City Hall on a Tuesday, if that's what feels right. I don't need 300 guests to know this is real. I said yes before he finished the sentence. And when I slipped the ring onto my finger myself, because some habits, it turned out, took longer to unlearn than others, it fit exactly the way it should have, without a single alteration. By the time spring rolled around again, we were married, in the courtyard of the hospital wing that bore my grandfather's name, under the same cherry trees that had tricked themselves into blooming early the year before. 22 guests. Priya from the office stood beside me instead of a sister who no longer occupied that role. Robert Sterling sent flowers, along with a short note that read simply, "Your grandfather would be proud of the woman you became, not just the trust you activated." I kept that note in the same drawer as the teacup saucer, which I'd stopped using for tea years earlier and started using instead to hold small things I wanted to keep close. There was no photographer chasing the perfect shot, no chanting crowd demanding a kiss for the camera. Just Marcus, steady and unhurried, waiting for me at the end of a short aisle lined with the same white flowers Natalie had once replaced with sunflowers on a balcony that no longer belonged to either of us. When he kissed me, nobody had to ask. Nobody counted the shutter clicks. It simply happened, quietly, exactly the way I'd learned real things tend to. I thought, standing there in a dress I'd chosen myself, fitted to nobody's assumptions but my own, about all the versions of that day I'd once imagined. The venue I'd never gotten to choose, the ring that had never really been mine, the seat that hadn't existed for me in a hall of 300 people. None of it had been a rehearsal for this. It had simply been the long, difficult road that taught me exactly what I refused to accept a second time. People love to say that the best revenge is living well, and for a long time I thought that was just a soft phrase people used to avoid admitting how much they actually wanted the other side to suffer. I understand it differently now. Living well was never the revenge. It was simply what became possible once I stopped shrinking myself to fit into rooms that had already decided there was no seat for me. I lost a great deal in that single year. A fiancé who was never really mine to lose. A friendship I'd mistaken for unconditional. A loss I will carry with me for the rest of my life in a way no boardroom victory could ever soften. I don't think I'll ever fully stop noticing that absence, and I've stopped expecting myself to. Grief like that doesn't resolve. It just learns to sit quietly beside everything else you build. But I also found, underneath all of it, a version of myself my grandfather had apparently seen coming from the very beginning. Patient enough to wait 6 years for a truth to surface entirely on its own terms, and brave enough when it finally did, to build something new instead of simply reclaiming what had already been taken from me. Ethan's apology in that parking lot didn't undo anything, and I never expected it to. Clara's message didn't restore a sisterhood I'm not sure ever truly existed the way I once believed it did. Neither of those things needed to heal me. I had already started healing myself quietly in rooms nobody else was watching, long before either of them found the courage to say anything at all. I still keep his old teacup on my desk, chipped handle and all, sitting beside a photograph of 2 people at a kitchen table who didn't yet know what they were building. Some mornings I fill it with coffee I don't finish, just to remember the conversation that started all of this. I don't need it to remind me who I am anymore. But I've decided, watching the light hit it every morning in an office that smells faintly of cinnamon from the bakery downstairs, that it's a good thing to keep close all the same. Proof that patience, when it finally pays out completely. And that the seat they never saved for me was never the one I actually needed in the first place.